Hello, everyone. I am Susann Moeller, Vice President of the Ohio Poetry Association, which is sponsoring the Ohioana panel discussion, Diverse Voices of Poetry. All festival sponsors and partners of Ohioana 2021 are listed on the Ohioana website, including Ohioana's official bookseller, the Book Loft of German Village. You can get copies of all the books featured at this year's festival by going online to bookloft.com. I've also put that in the chat. I'm pleased to welcome our authors on this panel, but I have to tell you, if I named all their accolades, our panel time would be over. So instead, I shall highlight a few and then refer you to the individual websites that I also put in the chat. Zoe Brigley, let's start with a Z. The last ones shall be the first ones, right? Looks at poetry from the feminist perspective often. And her book that was out last year. Actually, the authors that are on the panel today all put out their books this year or last year. Her book is Aubade After a French Movie. And the next one is Teri Ellen Cross Davis, who looks at the role of woman and mother, and particularly the role of a Black woman in America. And then we have our Ohio Poet Laureate, Kari Gunter-Seymour, who looks at Appalachian women in America. And finally, Philip Metris, who looks at wars, war zones, resistance, and his book is Shrapnel Maps. I should also say that Kari's book is A Place So Deep.
It can't be seen.
Oh no, I hope Susann is coming back.
I do too.
I do too.
Well, meanwhile, may I just take a moment to hold up all of our books? And I bought them all because I couldn't wait to read about each and every one of you. And I could speak the whole hour about the beauty in each one of these gorgeous, 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 wonderful books. And it always astounds me. I know all of you are academics and many of you teach, but I'm always so amazed that there are so many different words in the world and people bring them and they're different. They're not the same and we love them. And we're so, so lucky to have that. So I want to thank you all personally for these beautiful books. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Kari.
Thank you so much. Susann, are you back?
Yes.
Yes, what happened there?
You disappeared.
Yeah.
Well, I did not touch anything on my pilot panel. What did you hear me say last?
Oh, you were talking about Kari's books, but Kari jumped in there. Thank you, Kari.
So after Kari.
Yes, and continued on, powered on.
I mentioned Zoe, I mentioned Kari, did I mention yours, Teri?
The title of it, no, but you know, Kari had one.
Okay. And then Phil, you didn't hear what I said about yours.
Oh, I think I did. Yeah, I think.
Okay. So then I went on to say that what I believe you all have in common, other than being poets and writers, is that your writing is rooted in resilience and resistance, from the personal to the universal. And I wanted to start with something you, Phil, said a while ago, and that is, the purpose really of writing is to rouse the audience, to rouse us. It's a wake-up call to mysteries, miracles, and also the dilemmas that the human spirit faces. And so I was wondering, how do each and every one of you how do you rouse your audience? How do you elicit an echo?
Great question. Yeah, well, as people are thinking, I'll just say, you know, I took that from Isaiah, the
Yes.
prophet in Hebrew scriptures, you know, to give a word to the weary, a voice that will, or a word that will rouse them. And I was really thinking about the ways in which so much of our life, modern life, and indeed during this pandemic, is alienating, sequestering, numbing, dislocating us from our bodies and from our voices and stories and where we come from. So that's something that I hope that a poem in its use of language kind of sharpens our attention and awareness. You know, I am interested in poems that do like either discomfit or soothe, depending on one's point of view. And I just want to say one last thing before and then give it over. I looked up diverse right before this because you know, I'm a word nerd, and I think probably all of us share that sense. So the etymology of it, of diverse comes from diversus, the Latin, which means turned different ways or facing both ways. And I thought that was so powerful and such an opening for kind of a poetic temperament. And that's where I'll end.
I think diversa also means to separate, does it not?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I suppose, yeah. But
Yeah.
that original Latin root from the 14th, previous to the 14th century, yeah.
Oh, that's a really beautiful thought there from Philip. And I love that idea of using the words to rouse, to sort of wake up, to bring people into understanding as well, maybe. And for myself, I think that one of the really important things about poetry for me is not shying away from things that are difficult to talk about. And that is something that poetry does really well, actually. If it really is the best words in the best order, or all those kind of old definitions that we hear of poetry, then surely it really is a space in which we can explore really complex things and help people to find language sometimes to describe it. And one of the subjects that I've written a lot about in the past is domestic violence. And sometimes you'll find that survivors of domestic violence don't have a language with which to express what's happened to them. Or sometimes they don't even register what's happening to them as violence. And so I think that's something that poetry can do really well. But apart from that, in thinking about surviving violence or getting over experiences like that, I think we can also arouse people to feel wonder and joy and all those really wonderful emotions as well. And that's something that's really important for survival, for healing. And so, like in my most recent book, I went back to a medieval poet, in fact, a Welsh medieval poet, and started translating her. And what I found was that she had this incredible, like, physical joy about the body and relationships and desire. And it was just really liberating and wonderful. And I felt really roused by it. I felt really kind of enlivened by it, because it had a language for speaking about women's desire that we don't always feel able to speak, you know, and that women aren't encouraged to talk about those kinds of things. And I felt that it was something that was just really wonderful and liberating.
Zoe, you hit a lot of great spots there for me, talking about the language for female desire and power and all those things. I'm thinking about Suzann's question about echo. And as I was thinking and listening to the wonderful things Philip just said, and what you said too, Zoe, how incredible that is, I thought for me, trying to create that echo, it's an emotional echo. That if I get the emotion right in the poem, then it will strike a nerve. And I wish I knew music. It's like when you take that one key and you go down the whole piano thing. And it's like, if you strike that nerve right, it's like that for anyone who reads it, right? If you get the emotion right, then it can create these emotional echoes in the readers because you now honed in on it and they know that emotion too. So even if it's something within the ideas of feminine desire, which, you know, again, that's my soft spot. I like to write about those things. I like to give words to things that have been so ignored and just kind of maligned and also marginalized. And I like to give power to things that have been marginalized. Like I created this goddess of cleaning for this reason, and think about all the women in my life who have been domestic workers. And what did that mean to uplift this one element of cleaning and empower it? So yeah, Susann, if you're, you know, thinking about echoes and how you get things to resound, it's the emotional echo to me. It's like a clear bell, like a sound. And if I can hit that note just right, you can hear it go for miles.
So you don't, anyone anticipate any action to, if it is, your poem is to rouse emotions, are you satisfied with it just staying with an emotional response? Or do you also, I'm talking to the feminists in everyone here now, are you not also keen to elicit an action response? And this goes to Kari this time.
Well, I wanted to back up just for a minute and say that on the first question, that I think I haven't been writing that long, and I don't have that much longer to write because I think I'm probably the oldest person on the panel. And so I feel this need to,
you are one of the younger ones, let me tell you that.
I feel this huge need to write important work. I too have written about war. I too write about, you know, marginalized people, and I think it's our duty, and here's why. Because when you look back at history, the history books are full of what whoever was in power at that time wanted to have recorded. But if you look at the fine artists and you read the literature of the day, that's where you find history. That's what you find, what really was happening, especially anything that got burned and there's only a few copies left. That's where we need to look. And that's the kind of, I mean, I realize I am not a magnificent writer. I'm the first one to say that, but I do know that that's what I long to do. I want to do that writing that's going to be meaningful. And I do want to rouse people. I want to rouse them up real big. But I also know that there's flies to honey, right? And I learned that when my son kept getting deployed into the Middle East and all the young men around him were dying. And every day I wondered if my son was alive or dead. Is I realized I can't go out and scream and scream and scream at people because they are not going to listen to me. But when I weep, and I can do that quietly, and I can do it with my words, they listen. They listen. And that's when they did start listening. And then they started listening to all of us, and we pulled out of Iraq, and now we're pulling out of Afghanistan. And I'm not the person to say whether that's right or wrong. But I do know that we've spent trillions of dollars when we could have been feeding a lot of children who have no food in this country. People could have had decent places to live. They could have had better education. They could have free health care. They could have mental health care. And so, yes, I think we need to rouse people. Abso-effing-lutely. Okay.
Yeah, so Phil is part of the Peace and Justice and Human Rights program at John Carroll. So I am sure he has something to say about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I have two opposing feelings about it. One is that everyone has the opportunity to take the work where how it moves them. But it is true, for example, for this, you know, I wrote a book sort of about the Iraq War sand opera, and the most recent one's about the Israeli and Palestinian predicament. And I did want the poems, the book as a whole, and the poems to become part of the conversations to help us think about our relationship to not only our close by neighbors, but also the neighbors that we don't necessarily see every day that are impacted by not only U.S. foreign policy, but all sorts of other things going on in the world, and to recognize the fundamental humanity and dignity of every person. So I wanted people to be thinking globally and locally at the same time, and acting, you know, in those ways as well. And I have to say, like, I don't feel that, like Kari, in a lot of respects, I don't feel like an expert or an authority in what the right answers are for you know, any particular set of issues, but I want to be there in the place where we're asking the questions in a way that helps us open up other possibilities. Because clearly, what's been happening in our country, and there's so many things that we can do better.
And I need to apologize if I in some way said that I thought I was the authority, because I certainly do not.
No, and in fact, you overemphasized your humility. Actually, I think you're great. I think you're a wonderful writer.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember saying, and it translates into, so I have screamed at least. So if I've screamed, at least I've spoken. I say that in context also of, you know, quiet complicity. And Zoe and Teri, and Teri, you, from the feminist perspective, also have a word to say about that, right? I mean, just being quiet and silent is can be as dangerous and makes you as guilty as anything, actually.
Yeah, and that's so true. And again, I'm sorry, I just to divert, but I'm like, I get such a kick out of hearing Zoe and Teri together. Since just to tell everyone, Zoe's also my daughter's name. But that said, you know, I was thinking about something you said, Philip, struck a good nerve, and you were like, you know, writing and trying to bring forth the humanity and the dignity in people. And I think so often I feel like I'm in that position. Like every poem I write is a poem saying, in so many ways, Black Lives Matter, because I'm doing a thing as a Black person in America, and I'm writing. And like Lucille Clifton wrote, every day something has tried to kill me and failed. And so if I'm here and I'm writing, that in itself is a sense of Black resistance. I think Audre Lorde would say, right? Like I'm just resisting by existing. And trying to do this work as a poet. And I'm trying, every poem is in so many ways a shout for dignity and a shout for my humanity and for the humanity of those who I love and those who look like me and those who I've made. I can't tell you, I'm just like, you know, how many poems are in this book, A More Perfect Union, about like just my son and my daughter, and trying to have them live in a country where they can actually make it to the ripe age of 90, you know, and I know they won't make it. They're unmolested by the powers that be. I know that, yet I still created them, you know, which is a whole other thing. But there's just something to that, what you said, Philip. And so, and two, yeah, it's complicit. You're to be ignorant is to be complicit too. To be, and it's no excuse for it. It's no excuse for ignorance of humanity. It's no excuse for ignorance of how pervasive racism and, you know, is in this country. Institutional racism, structural racism, the language, the information, the reports, the deaths. I've been screaming for 400 years to be taken as a human being. You know what I mean? So that's, and I also think too about what you said about rousing to action. Yeah, the emotional echoes there, but I think sometimes too, that can convert to like a thought process. It can change. It's a shift of paradigm sometimes when you begin to realize that you've overlooked things, that you've not done all you can to recognize the humanity in your neighbor or in someone who lives 2 towns over from you. And I hope that, you know, in this moment where it seems like poetry is having this bright light, that people take this moment to look deeper inside themselves and figure out ways that they can change. And the change can start with you just saying hello to a neighbor. So
yeah, so that's the important part too. I mean, we can all write, and we can possibly write great stuff or not so great stuff. For me, the question is always, how do I gauge actually the echo? How do I gauge the dialogue that I'm inviting? Will I have a dialogue partner? and who are my dialogue partners, because that is important to me, or else it's just art for art's sake, and I can just sit in my cubicle and write for myself. So that really is the big question for me. How do you gauge engagement? Zoe, what do you think?
I love what you're saying. And I think that whenever I'm writing anything, quite often I'll have two questions. And the first question is this helping anyone? And secondly, is this harming anyone? Always thinking on those two questions. And then, you know, I think sometimes going back to this idea of silence can be very harmful, particularly when it's preventing people from speaking about things which would be helpful for them to speak about. And it makes me think of how, like in my own experience, like I've had like multiple instances of miscarriage, and I didn't write about it for a very long time. I didn't feel able to. I was just processing what had happened. And then one day I just wrote something and put it up on my blog, and it was about miscarriage, my experience of it. And I posted it on my social media on Facebook. And what was incredible to me was the like outpouring of responses that I had from women about it. And so many women were saying, this is something which really expresses how I felt too. And that it was, you know, it was incredible. The response to it was so warm and full of like relief, I think, that somebody had just suddenly like broken the taboo and said something about it. And that was really incredible to me. And it was, you know, it became like a kind of community of women, of us supporting each other. And talking about these things and having conversations about it. And that was just an incredible experience for me. And I began to see that actually, you know, if I asked those questions, it was helping people to write about it if you thought about it ethically and tried to do it in a particular way. And the other thing that I think about is I'm often worrying about not just kind of confining my writing to my own experience too. So, for example, when I was writing a book a few years ago called Hand and Skull, which was about domestic violence and violence against women, one ethical question that I thought about a lot was how, like, my specific experience, you know, as a kind of a white woman was different to other people's. And I really wanted to think about how I could lift up other voices. And so I was reading a lot of cases and making notes and writing things down. And I ended up trying in at least some of the poems to write about other people as well. So it wasn't just about myself. And it was kind of ethically challenging because, you know, I didn't want to speak for anybody else, but at the same time, I wanted to try and lift up other people's voices. So I did the best I could with that. But I think it's really important to ask yourself those questions and say, you know, are there things that I need to include? And I was sort of interested thinking about Philip's work, which I know has kind of use of kind of documentary style stuff as well. So I was kind of interested to compare, or if any of the other poets had sort of, you know, thought about, you know, including other people's experiences or case studies or, you know, things like that in their work.
Yeah, I think it is important to also go beyond your own experience. Otherwise, you know, your echo is confined to those who identify with it, right? And that is a smaller group than the rest of us. And I think what Phil does, and I need you to respond to that, Philip, because I'm second guessing here. You are talking about, well, so to speak, a different type of Cold War, or maybe it is semi-hot. It's always semi-hot there. So you're talking about war experiences that you have not gone through yourself. And so you elevate this entire experience onto another level. So what is the echo that you're after and that you have found?
Well, right. There's a lot of things I can say about that. I mean, I should say that my dad is a Vietnam War veteran, and my sister was married to a Palestinian man. And so war has come home in my life in a lot of different ways. So although it is true that I physically have not lived in a war zone, that I've experienced something of the psychic and emotional inheritances and reverberations of that. But at the same time, there's always this question about insiders and outsiders. How does one speak about something that's not one's own experience? And I think it's really tricky, honestly. And I felt that I wanted to be very careful about how I approached what is already an overly represented and also violently erasing kind of set of stories, which is the stories of Palestinians and the stories of Israelis and of Jews, of course, as well. And the responses to my book have been various, and some of them have been just bring me to tears, honestly. Just people saying, thank you. This this captures something of my experience. You know, this poet from Gaza, Mosab Abu Toha, said, you know, he read the poem very carefully about Gaza, and at the end he said, and you're an honorary Gazan, is what he said to me. And I felt like, wow, that is a great. I've never been there. I just read about it. I talked with people. I did my research. But at the same time, there have been people who've been deeply upset by and unsettled by things in that book, because representation is unsettling. If one sees oneself or one sees one's community represented, it can be, you know, like I'm thinking about Samaria Rice, you know, the mother of Tamir Rice in Cleveland here, and how deeply, profoundly upset she has been by some activists who, you know, really want change, that they've kind of used Tamir's death in ways that she didn't like. And so I'm just really struck by the care. I thought Zoe really articulated, and Teri as well, this need to be careful. And I don't mean careful in the sense of protecting oneself, but to act with care and gentleness and slowness. And then that's something we can bring to this activity when we're dealing with, you know, histories and peoples and traumas that are so much in need of healing and in need of transformation.
Yeah, so I'm also reminded, I wrote about the reception of Holocaust literature here in the United States and in Germany. And so for me, of course, it is a vicarious experience, a secondary experience, but it is, as you say, it is still an experience, but it's not firsthand. So since it's not firsthand, isn't the idea, and that ties into what Teri said earlier, you know, she's looking for an emotional response. Is it not, and I look at your poetry that way, Philip, and I responded to it that way, is it not there to elicit empathy?
I would hope so.
Yeah.
I would certainly hope so. And by empathy, you know, there's sometimes a criticism that empathy is just about having a feeling that we could understand the other. I really do, and that gets at this question, this conundrum that you offered to us, that I don't want people just to have a feeling, you know, like I want them to move into that the feeling is a door to something else. And the feeling is essential because our feelings are so benumbed, but the feeling is not the end point, but a kind of an opening to something else. That's my hope, you know.
I wanted to just jump in there because something you said, Susann, and what you were saying too, Philip, about trying to write about experiences, and I know this stemmed from Zoe's answer, writing about experiences that one has either been through or experiences that one has not gone through, and in terms of, you know, expanding the scope of your work and your craft beyond your own personal world. And I know for me, persona has been really instrumental for me to have a way to talk about other experiences that I've read about or seen that that I just couldn't shake. And I think about a little bit of I was recording my grandmother who passed away like 2 years ago, and she passed away at like 93, and I had been recording her stories. And so I integrated her words into a poem, in the second book. But even in the first book, there were 2 newspaper articles that, actually more than 2. One about a woman named Yvette Cady, whose husband put gasoline in the, I think you all might remember, she was on Oprah and put gasoline in the fire in a Sprite can and tried to burn her alive at her job. And I couldn't shake that story. And then there was another story about 2 different teens, young teens, like 12, 13, who had children in Cleveland, and those children end up dying by the hand of their parents by accident, one could say. And I couldn't shake those stories. And so it becomes that way of going through these other stories to get at something in the poem. Like, and to me also, it comes to, again, giving voice to the marginalized, to those who history have forgotten. Someone said it earlier. History, I think it was you, Kari. History is written by our victors. I'm watching that Exterminate All the Brutes documentary. History is written by the colonizers. It's written by those who win the war. And it's always their stories. And whose stories get obliterated, whose stories get forgotten. That's why I'm so intrigued too, Zoe, by the research you're doing into that poet. And it's just like, sometimes I think it's up to us to bring those stories back out, to give voices to those people who, there's a picture I'd seen by, this artist, it was in a book about the history of Black female bodies in photography, and so often Black women's bodies have just been used as props. And so every time I was reading through this book and came across pictures, and I thought, did that Black woman have something to say? We would never know. Maybe she couldn't write, we'll never know. And so if I can do this, where I can find these words and put them together in a way that elicits something, then isn't it my job to do that? Isn't it my job to pull her history out and make sure we don't forget how we've treated people? And what story, what wealth she had, and that wealth isn't tied to education. It's tied to our humanity. It's tied to experience. It's tied to life. And that's my job to bring it forward. So yeah,
that's also what
I
Kari
really-
does very well with her characters. Kari, yeah.
Yeah, I was just about to say amen, sister, because, I can trace my family 9 generations back. I know that, my ancestor got on the boat in Berkshire, England, and came to Henrico County, Virginia to work the coal mines. And, eventually they evolved into farming. And I always say whenever I'm anywhere that it's because I have these strong women in my background, and I can tell you story after story after story, is the reason I'm allowed to sit here today in front of all of you and be a poet. I don't have to go work the fields. I don't have to milk the cows. I don't have to drive the wagons. My grandmother and grandfather were sustaining farmers. I mean, and our whole lives, what people said to us, more or less, you're overfed, you're undereducated, you're undergroomed, you can't be intelligent. But my grandfather fed a huge family for 25, 30 years plus off the land, just off the land. Can you even imagine not going to the grocery store and feeding 8 kids? I mean, it just astounds me. I'm so proud of them. And for people to think that we are less than, infuriates me as well. And so, yeah, I spend my time on that. I spend my time talking about that. I've spent the last 12 years with the Women of Appalachia Project, lifting up other women's voices throughout Appalachia. The whole 420 counties, plus anybody who's connected to or tied in some way to are invited to submit. And we have our own anthology, the Women of Appalachia Project anthology, and we do readings throughout Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky. We are spreading the word that we are not who you think we are. We are ever, ever, ever so much more.
Teri, you also belong to a group, right, that is uplifting other women and came out with an anthology. Is that not correct?
That is true. I'm part of the Black Women's Brunch Collective, the Black Ladies Brunch Collective, and we have an anthology that came out in 2017, Not Without Our Laughter. Yeah, so it's
and you all went tripping.
Yes, we actually went to Ireland to support the book in was that 2017? Yeah, that was 2017. And we had a great time, and you know, consequently there's some Ireland poems in the second book. You know how that works.
Yeah.
And but yeah, it just, I mean, and it covers some ground, like we're, you know, cisgender, we're bisexual, we're queer, we're American, we're Guyanese, we're Canadian. It's we're Midwestern. It's like we all come from, we're Jamaican and Swedish. It's like we are all, 6 of us are just very, very different. But we share this identity as a Black woman in America, and it's an identity that we claim. And yeah, it was a lot. And just to have an anthology of just our work, and then us responding to each other's work at different times was a great opportunity and a great way to stretch. Thank
Wonderful.
you. Thank you.
Well, so since we talked about our various viewpoints and what we would like to see happening from our poetry with our poetry, and we started out with resilience and resistance, let's talk about those two a little bit more. To close out our panel discussion. Resilience and resistance really figure in not just, it figure in life altogether, not just as a poet. I mean, without resilience, sometimes things are so dismal, you probably shoot yourself. And without resistance, the same. Philip, what is your response to that?
Yeah. So the subtitle of a book of essays that I wrote, The Sound of Listening, was Poems of Poetry as Refuge and Resistance. And resilience is nice. I like that because it's a dynamic, it's a word about dynamism and about the fact of our life force being able to withstand the challenges that are part of life. You know, resistance was always part of the picture for me as a poet, because the dominant culture just seemed so toxic and so poisonous and problematic. And so just being able to say no seemed like a holy act, an act of reclamation of dignity. And as Teri said, you know, so many, and Kari and Zoe in various ways, right? That so many stories are lost because the dominant culture doesn't perceive them as important or central or necessary. And of course they are. So that resistance is to say, like, no to those silencings, no to the indignities that people are experiencing, whether because of gender, race, class, background, ethnicity, religion, etc. But I would just say one more thing is that resistance is never enough on its own. And you know, like the anthology title of Teri's anthology about this, the essence, the importance of laughter, of community, of drawing upon the labor and the spirit of our ancestors and our traditions, I think pull us forward sort of into the world. I've sort of gotten obsessed with my ancestors. I do a lot of genealogical work and things like that, because I feel like I feel that they abide with us, and sometimes they haunt us, and I try to figure out which is which and how to bring forth what I hope they would have wanted to bring forth. So that's where my resilience, I think, comes from, some of those things.
And persistence too. I mean, I remember I started teaching in 1972 and was at the University of Georgia, was using the Norton Anthology for Western World Literature. And I think there was but one, maybe, I don't even think it was the second one, female author in there included. And so it's a long, long way that you come. So I think persistence is almost as important as resilience. Zoe, persistence in the feminist struggle. What do you have to say about that?
It's really interesting. I'm listening to what people are talking about, and I liked what Philip said about needing resistance and refuge. Because you might be working really hard to change things, and sometimes it can be overwhelming. Sometimes you need community, you need laughter and joy and all those things. And I guess I'm thinking about this from a feminist perspective, but also as someone who's an ecological feminist. And one of my main lockdown projects, while I've been sort of locked away the past year, has been working on an anthology, which is coming out in the UK in July and in the States in the fall, which is called 100 Poems to Save the Earth. And I always feel like I have to qualify the title a little bit, because I don't think that poems are literally going to save the earth. And yet at the same time, something that we really hope for the anthology is that we manage to do a number of things which kind of help us to think about climate crisis and some of the problems we have at the moment. And one of those things is simply processing what is sometimes labeled as like ecological grief, where we see, things like fires in California on the West Coast or Australia, where all kinds of like biodiversity is wiped out, extinction, all kinds of things are happening. And actually it can be quite overwhelming. And I think something that poetry can really do is to help us to process those feelings, because it can stop you from feeling like you could make a difference, like you can act. And I think that sometimes poetry does that for us, whatever kind of cause or problem we're talking about, that it can help us to process our feelings so that we have somewhere to put them, so that we have a language, like I was saying before, to talk about whatever the issue is. And but apart from that, I also hope that some of the poems just remind us of how wonderful the world is, the environment is, that nature is, and not spectacular nature, but in lockdown we've just been stuck in our houses with like the local park or the bit of scrub land down the road that we go where we go and walk the dog or whatever, and just appreciating that kind of everyday nature and how amazing it is, and noticing things that we perhaps never noticed before. I think that can be really something that lifts us up as well.
Yes. That sounds so cool. I look forward to hearing more about that anthology, or seeing when is it forthcoming?
Yeah, so like I was saying, at the end of June, beginning of July in the UK, and in the fall for the US, and we have some great writers in it. Like Ross Gay has got a poem in there, and David Baker, Camille Dungy, as well, who I think is a wonderful writer. So Amy Nezukuma-Tatil. So we've got some great American writers and a lot of really great UK poets that you might not know as well. So I'm really excited about that.
Sounds beautiful.
What's the title again, Zoe?
100 Poems to Save the Earth.
Okay, great, thank you.
Who's the publisher?
It's a Welsh publisher called Susann, well known in the UK, but yeah, we're all very excited about launching it in the US as well this year.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah.
And there's also the movement 100,000 Poets for Change. And so the Ohio Poetry Association is part of that. So I think those are all really notable endeavors. There are 2 anthologies that, in fact, I put out, eco-poetry. They're called Open Earth 1 and Open Earth 2, published by PM books. So yes, I do think that it is high time that eco-poetry move into the forefront of our digestive process again.
I like that.
But something that really interests me though is that I think it does connect back actually to some of the social issues we've been talking about. So this was something that really fascinated me in a bad way, was how like sometimes damage to the environment and like harm to people sort of happen simultaneously. So you might find like there's a neighborhood that's being gentrified and like wild patches of land are being built on, or stuff's being done to them at the same time. So, it's like two things happening at once. Or if you think of like, oil pipelines that are put through like Native American land and how it's sort of harming the environment and people at the same time, and often marginalized people. So I just think that's interesting, that and something that needs to be part of the environmental movement is being aware of like how the social issues interconnect.
Right. As you said that, all I could think about was like, oh, you mean redlining, and how they'll put like the bus depot in the poor Black neighborhood, and all of a sudden there'll be a rise in asthma, and they're like, oh, what happened? Or Flint, where you have lead poisoning and bad pipes, and oh, what happened? And I love the cluelessness that seems to occur when these things happen. Like, you didn't think this through. Maybe you didn't think that this would actually harm people, or you did, and you just figured it was people you didn't care about. Oh, that's really where we go. It's just people you didn't, people that don't get the attention, and they don't yell enough. And yeah.
And also, food deserts, that so that in those sections of town, people really have no access to really healthy food. And that ties into, of course, again, ecology and social justice issues, right? I mean, I'm seeing that in the community garden projects and urban agricultural projects everywhere around, well, not just Ohio, but yeah, that goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
Well, we have, I'm sorry, go ahead, Teri.
Oh, no, go ahead, Kari.
No, I was just going to say, our country pays $50 a head to kill coyotes, but they won't feed children, school children. And, there's something very wrong with that, because coyote populations assimilate. Like if they have a lot of theirs killed, then they will have big litters. If they do not have a lot of theirs killed, then they have small litters. They are in tune with nature. And that's something unique about coyote. And we will never control the coyote population. They control themselves. Yet we will let children starve and give people $50 a head to shoot coyotes. So, what can you say when, that kind of thing is going on, when that's the thinking?
Yeah. What can you say? I mean, I was just going to add like,
but I can say it, right? I can at least say it so people know it.
Right.
Yeah, shout it out. Shout it from the rooftops.
Right. And exactly. I do have a poem, yes.
You can write that poem. And I just I was just tripping back to what Susann said about the food deserts. And I'm thinking, yes. And, then we have cholesterol issues, and then we have diabetes, but yet it's the fault of those people. It's their fault that these issues occur. And I was also thinking about Arlene Geronimus, who talked about weathering in Black women's bodies, how Black women inside internally are like 7 years older than the average white woman because of all the stress, social, economic stress, racial stress that you have to deal with. I mean, every time I see a cop pass, my heartbeat goes up, and I think about every negative interaction I've had with the police, and there's been more than one. So and I'm 5'3", so it's not like I'm a threat. But
that just breaks my heart so badly, Teri. I really hate to hear that. I apologize for my race. I do.
It's, being a Black person and aware in America, James Baldwin has a quote about that, but it's also a kind of PTSD. You learn to unfortunately live with it, and, but it has its effects. Again, weathering, and what Arlene Geronimus has coined. And that's why BLBC was so crucial, and is so crucial for me, to have that outlet of joy, to have the outlet of someone, just a group of women who understand without me having to explain a lot.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But I think a lot about that resilience and resistance. I mean, I really did write a poem called "This Poem Suggests Revolution" for a reason.
Yeah, and I'm just registering, you know, listening to Teri, how like we do not measure like the legacy of traumatic experiences, whether that is like, you know, racist violence or, you know, violence against women generally, or, you know, violence against different marginalized groups. We don't really register it or measure it. And so I think it's really important when Teri brought that up and said that about how physically, you know, it does stuff to you. It makes me think of, there's a brilliant book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is all about this, how like the difficult traumatic things that we experience really deeply affect us. And I don't think we always measure it. Oh, thanks for holding that up, Philip. Yeah, that's it. It's a great book.
Mm. Yeah, they talk about, and like there's blood trauma, there's blood memory. That's what it is, right? I think that's the term that they call it. And then because they've done it for, you know, families that have survived the Holocaust, and how like that trauma is transmitted through generation and through generation. And as soon as I read that, of course, not of course, but I begin to think about what other traumas occurred. I think about the Middle Passage, and I think about slavery, and I think about what internal effects are we still carrying that have yet to be diagnosed, right? But it's still always, you know, Black people's fault that we didn't do a thing or whatever. So I just, you know, that whole idea about blood trauma. And it's like, it's funny because Philip, your thing about I was in a conversation this morning with a whole bunch of poets, and we were talking about ancestry and ancestral worship. And I'm like, wow, I love how like these vines go out into the universe and connect and blossom in different places. And I didn't even know there was a rose hiding in your backyard, but there it is.
I'm happy to hear that.
And in our culture, ancestor is so huge. I mean, that's why I brag. You know, the first thing I said is I can trace my family back 9 generations, because that, I'm proud of that, and I'm proud of them, and it's very important to me. And I agree with you. I think things that happen to our people through the years do come down with us, whether it's, now in my culture, they come down in stories. You know, we literally share the stories generation to generation, but not every family gets that privilege to have people in their family live long enough to have that happen. And I realize that, but it is a precious, wonderful thing to be able to lift up your stories. And that's what I get to do. A lot of what I write about is what I kind of know.
Well, that's also what the Jewish community is concerned with right now. When the person with the last camp tattoo dies, then where is memory going to go, right? We have a question in the question and answer section. Zoe, could you speak a little to your experience as a bi-pan person, how that affects your poetry? Yeah. You saw that coming. I saw that in your nod.
Yeah, I saw the question, and I could definitely speak to that. I think that I'm very open about being a bi-pan person, simply because there's a real problem with bi visibility. Somebody in the chat is saying that I'm frozen, so I'm just checking. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you're fine.
Yes.
Good. Yeah, so like I feel like there's a real problem with bi visibility, and that is partly because like we have a real lack of really good sex education, or education about sexuality as well, and that's something that really on like a number of levels, like, you know, teaching young people about consent, teaching people about sexuality beyond like the heteronormative is something that's very dear to me. And there's a wonderful poem by Mary Howe called Practicing, which is about this issue of how like young women, you know, and for a long time, I don't think I realized I was bi, to be honest. And it took some time to kind of process that and realize that was something that I could be. And I think that's probably because people tended to not take it seriously. So if someone was to say, oh, I'm bisexual, that they would sort of like almost accuse people of making it up or doing it for attention-seeking reasons, or there are all these kind of myths around bisexuality. And so it took me quite a while to really realize that that was something I identified with. And I think that, you know, for me, really emphasizing that and not hiding it at all. And of course, it's up to every person. It's nobody's business, really, what someone else's sexuality is. But for me, it's just about perhaps like reaching people who are younger than me, who might have gone through similar experiences where bi identity was like ridiculed or not taken seriously or dismissed, and to just say that you know, it's okay, it's completely fine. You can be this, and that is absolutely okay.
Well, thank you for answering that question. I am afraid, much to my chagrin, and according to all the comments in the Q&A, also to the chagrin of our audience, we'll have to go and scatter in different directions now. And so I would like to thank our panelists again, Zoe, Teri, Kari, Philip, and also the woman behind the scenes, Catherine. Thank you so much. I would like to thank our festival sponsors and